The gentle hum of conversation filled the air inside a well-lit jewelry store in Portland, Maine. Gleaming cases lined the walls, showcasing rings, necklaces, and gems that shimmered under the soft glow of strategically placed lights. Each piece seemed to hold a story, a whisper of elegance waiting to adorn someone's life. At the entrance, Beatrice stepped in, adjusting her worn leather purse on her shoulder. She was in her late 70s, her silver curls tucked neatly beneath a beret. She looked around with a familiar smile, her dark eyes taking in the displays she'd seen countless times before. Beatrice's son, Henry, had poured his heart into this store, transforming it into one of the most admired spots in town. Every time she stepped inside, she felt a surge of pride knowing her boy had built this success from the ground up. Today, Beatrice had come to surprise Henry. It was a routine of theirs. Every few weeks, she dropped by unannounced, bringing him lunch from his favorite cafe. She had a soft spot for these visits, watching him interact with clients and seeing him in his element. But today, Henry was out. A brief message from the clerk at the front desk explained he'd stepped away for a meeting with a new supplier and would be back shortly. Beatrice didn't mind. She could easily spend time browsing the displays, letting her thoughts wander. As she walked down the aisles, her fingers lightly brushed the glass cases, feeling a warmth that only came from years of familiarity. Her eyes drifted to a particular set of diamond earrings. They reminded her of a pair she'd once owned many years ago, long before life's demands forced her to sell them. For a moment, a flicker of nostalgia washed over her. Lost in thought, Beatrice leaned closer to get a better look at the earrings. Captivated by their sparkle, she moved slightly, her fingers resting against the glass. But then, a small slip, her hand brushed against the edge of the stand, and one of the earrings tipped over, falling to the floor with a quiet clink. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. She bent down slowly, careful with her movements, feeling a touch of embarrassment for causing a scene, even if no one had seemed to notice. As she reached out to pick up the earring, a pair of sharp heels clicked against the floor behind her. Beatrice looked up, blinking as a tall, stern-faced saleswoman stood over her. The woman, who Beatrice didn't recognize, must have been new to the store. Her expression was unreadable, yet Beatrice sensed a chill in her gaze. There was no warmth, no trace of the familiar friendliness she'd grown accustomed to in this place her son owned. But Beatrice brushed it off, trying to explain as she rose to her feet. "I'm so sorry, dear," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I just wanted a closer look. This earring reminds me of a pair I once." But the woman didn't let her finish. With a glare that pierced through Beatrice, the saleswoman crossed her arms, looking her over with an expression that held more than just disapproval. Her voice was sharp and cold, cutting through the air like glass. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. Beatrice straightened herself, holding up the earring delicately. "I accidentally knocked it over," she explained. "I was just admiring it, and—" "Admiring it?" the saleswoman interrupted, her tone dripping with disdain. "You mean pocketing it, don't you?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and stifling. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. "Pocketing it? That's absurd. I've never—" But the woman wasn't listening. Her eyes swept over Beatrice, taking in her modest coat and weathered purse. Something cruel flickered in her expression. "People like you don't belong in stores like this," she hissed, her words quiet but venomous, laced with an unspoken prejudice that cut into Beatrice like a blade. Beatrice's hand trembled as she held out the earring. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice faltering. The saleswoman stepped closer, snatching the earring from Beatrice's hand with a force that startled her. "Save your excuses," she snapped. "I'm calling the police." Beatrice's heart pounded in her chest. The sheer absurdity of the situation made her head spin. "The police? That's not necessary," she pleaded. "I didn't do anything wrong." Ignoring her protests, the saleswoman pulled out her phone and began dialing, her voice unnervingly composed as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes, I need officers at Grace and Elegance Jewelers. We've caught someone trying to steal a diamond earring. She's still here, and I've detained her." Detained? Beatrice whispered in disbelief. She took a step back, clutching the strap of her purse as if it might ground her in the chaos swirling around her. The next moments unfolded in a blur. She barely registered the sound of the front door swinging open or the quick, heavy steps of two police officers entering the store. Both men were tall, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. They walked directly toward the saleswoman, who immediately launched into a theatrical recounting of events. "This woman," she declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Beatrice, "was caught red-handed trying to steal this earring. I had to stop her before she fled." Beatrice's hands shook as she tried to speak. "I wasn't trying to steal anything," she said, her voice wavering. "It was an accident. Please, I'm the owner's mother." The officers exchanged a glance, but their attention remained on the saleswoman. One of them turned to Beatrice, his gaze hard and impersonal. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step forward." Beatrice took a step closer, her knees weak. "Please, this is a mistake," she said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Before she could say another word, the officer grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly to the side. The sudden force made her stumble, and she winced as they twisted her hands behind her back. The cold metal of handcuffs clamped around her wrists with a deafening click. "What are you doing?" Beatrice cried out, panic flooding her voice. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked around the store, searching for a friendly face, for anyone who might help. But there was no one, just the saleswoman, watching with a triumphant smirk. "I didn't steal anything," Beatrice said, her voice cracking as tears began to spill down her cheeks. "You're making a mistake." One of the officers spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. "You can explain yourself down at the station." The words hit her like a blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. Down at the station? Beatrice had lived a long life, faced her share of challenges, but never, not once, had she ever been treated like this. The humiliation was unbearable. She felt like a criminal, though she'd done nothing wrong. As the officers began leading her toward the door, their grip firm and unyielding, Beatrice's mind raced, each thought more desperate than the last. How had this nightmare begun? How had her son's store, a place that had always felt safe, become a source of such pain? Just as they reached the threshold, a voice boomed from across the room. "What the hell is going on here?" The officers paused, and Beatrice turned her head toward the source of the voice. Her heart leapt as she saw Henry standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and fury. Henry strode forward, his presence commanding attention. His tailored suit, standard for meetings with suppliers, was slightly wrinkled, as though he'd rushed back. His jaw was tight, his movements quick and deliberate as he took in the scene. His mother handcuffed and tearful, the officers holding her arms, and the saleswoman standing smugly to the side. "Take those off her," Henry ordered, his voice low but charged with barely restrained anger. One officer cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Sir, we were responding to a theft complaint." "Take them off," Henry repeated, each word clipped and precise. His dark eyes burned as he stepped closer, his focus shifting to his mother. "Are you okay, Mom?" Beatrice nodded weakly, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything, Henry. I just dropped an earring." Henry turned to the saleswoman, his expression icy. "Miss Turner, care to explain why you thought calling the police on my mother was a good idea?" Miss Turner faltered, clearly caught off guard. "Sir, I didn't know she was your mother. She dropped the earring, and it looked like, well, I thought she was trying to." "You thought?" Henry snapped, his voice rising slightly. "What gave you the right to assume my mother, of all people, was a thief?" Miss Turner stammered, her confidence crumbling. "I was just trying to protect the store." Henry let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Protect the store? From my own mother? Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just insult her. You insulted me. This business, and everything we stand for." He gestured toward Beatrice, who was still trembling. "Look at her. Does she look like a thief to you?" Miss Turner's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Henry turned to the officers, who had yet to remove the handcuffs. "Are you seriously just standing there?" he demanded. Do you even have any evidence she was stealing? Or did you just take this woman's word for it? The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances before one of them finally stepped forward and removed the cuffs. As soon as Beatrice's hands were free, Henry was by her side, rubbing her wrists gently. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said softly. "You shouldn't have gone through that." Beatrice shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand how it got this far." Henry straightened, his anger surging once more as he addressed the room. "This ends now," he said firmly, his gaze locked onto Miss Turner. "You're fired. I don't need people like you representing my business." Miss Turner's face turned ashen. "Sir, please. I didn't know." "I don't care," Henry interrupted, his tone cold and final. "Get out. Now." Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her belongings, avoiding everyone's eyes as she hurried out the door. Henry turned to the officers next. "And you too. You owe my mother an apology. She's been humiliated enough for one day." One officer cleared his throat awkwardly. "We were following protocol based on the complaint." "Protocol?" Henry shot back, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Your protocol is to slap handcuffs on an elderly woman without investigating the truth? That's what you call protecting and serving." The officers stood silent, their earlier confidence evaporating. Finally, one mumbled, "We're sorry, ma'am." Beatrice looked at them, her expression unreadable. She simply nodded before Henry ushered her to a chair near the counter. "Sit down, Mom," Henry said gently, his hand on her shoulder. "I'll take care of everything." As Beatrice sank into the seat, Henry turned back to the officers. "You can leave now. I'll be filing a formal complaint about how this was handled." The officers hesitated before nodding slightly and heading for the door, their departure marked by an awkward silence. Henry knelt beside Beatrice, his voice softening. "You okay? Do you need anything?" Beatrice shook her head, her hand resting over his. "I just want to go home." Henry exhaled, a mix of relief and lingering frustration washing over him. "We'll go soon. But first, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again." The days that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls, statements, and legal proceedings. Henry wasted no time filing an official complaint against the officers and pressing charges against Miss Turner for defamation. Beatrice, though shaken, supported her son's decision. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about preventing anyone else from enduring the same humiliation. The news spread quickly. Grace and Elegance Jewelers, once known for its elegant reputation, became the center of a heated conversation about prejudice and accountability. Customers voiced their support for Henry's actions, though a few questioned the decision to fire Miss Turner so publicly. Henry remained unyielding. "There's no room for that kind of behavior in my business," he told a local reporter, "and there shouldn't be room for it anywhere." Miss Turner faced her own reckoning. Security footage from the store left no doubt about what had occurred. The recording captured her aggression and blatant refusal to listen to Beatrice's explanations. It also revealed the officer's rough treatment, fueling public outrage. In court, Miss Turner appeared visibly shaken. Gone was her confident, cold demeanor. She now looked small and fragile, her hands trembling as she sat at the defense table. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically, using the footage and witness testimonies to paint a clear picture of her actions. Beatrice, at Henry's insistence, did not have to testify. Instead, the prosecutor relied on the video and statements from the officers, who admitted they had acted too quickly. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Miss Turner was convicted of defamation and handed a sentence that included community service and mandatory sensitivity training. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Henry and Beatrice. Henry spoke confidently, his words carrying the weight of someone determined to make a difference. "This isn't just about what happened to my mother," he said. "It's about ensuring no one else has to face this kind of treatment. Discrimination has no place in our society, and it's up to all of us to fight against it." Beatrice, standing beside him, spoke more softly but with equal conviction. "I've lived a long life," she said, her voice steady despite the crowd. and I've seen too much of this. But I believe in my son, and I believe we can do better. We have to." The crowd murmured in agreement as cameras flashed, capturing a moment that felt both personal and universal. Beatrice's resilience and Henry's determination turned a moment of injustice into a call for change. In the days after the verdict, Beatrice's life slowly returned to a new normal. She resumed her weekly visits to the store, though now she was greeted with even more warmth by staff and customers alike. The incident had changed her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it made her stronger. Henry implemented significant changes at the store, introducing new training programs for his staff focused on fairness and cultural sensitivity. He invited community leaders to hold workshops, ensuring Grace and Elegance Jewelers became a place where everyone felt respected and welcome. The store's reputation began to recover, bolstered by Henry's transparency and dedication to making things right. One afternoon, as Beatrice sat in her son's office sipping tea, she looked at Henry with pride. "You've done well," she said softly, "not just with the store, but with standing up for what's right." Henry smiled, his hand resting on hers. "I had a good example to follow," he said. "You taught me everything I know about resilience." Outside the store, the community had rallied together, inspired by their story. Discussions about prejudice and accountability became more frequent, not just in Portland but in neighboring towns. Beatrice and Henry's story was shared widely, sparking conversations that reached far beyond their small city. As Beatrice prepared to leave the store that day, Henry walked her to the door. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the street. Beatrice paused, taking in the view, then looked back at her son. "I know this wasn't easy," she said, "but you turned something awful into something meaningful. That's how change happens." Henry nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And it's not over. There's still so much to do." Beatrice smiled, her heart filled with a quiet sense of hope. "One step at a time, son." As she walked away, the bell above the door chimed softly. The sound, once routine, now felt like a reminder of resilience and progress. Beatrice knew the world wasn't perfect, but she also knew change was possible, one step, one story, one act of courage at a time.